Welcome to online training on impact evaluation for evidence-based development for the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs of the Gambia. Module 2, Lesson 1, Determining Points of Impact Evaluation. The outline for this module will be the learning outcomes and the module lessons. Lesson 1 of module 2 is program theory and types of evaluation questions. Lesson 2 is evaluation hypothesis and impact evaluation indicators. The learning outcomes for module 2 are that participants are expected to understand the theoretical frameworks that guide impact evaluation practice before considering the methodology for impact evaluation. It's also expected that participants will understand the theory of change and the results chain to ensure that impact evaluation designs are driven by intention and purpose. Module 2, Lesson 1. Program theory and evaluation questions. Lesson outline. In this lesson, I will share the expected outcomes and provide an overview of the lesson, then delve into the program theory aspect. Then we'll also look at the role of program theory in informing impact evaluation. And then finally, examine frameworks for designing impact evaluation. The expected outcomes for lesson 1 is that participants will be able to understand the role of program theory in the impact evaluation process. Then it is also expected that at the end of the lesson, participants will be able to demonstrate application and use of theory in impact evaluation design. Introduction. Lesson 1 dwells on the role of program theory in impact evaluation, and it attempts to tease out the understanding of intervention logic, which is very critical at the early stage in the evaluation process. This is so because it clarifies the outcomes and their intent, as well as it defines the expected relationships among the investment, the outputs conferred, and the outcomes expected out of the intervention. Program theory and program logic. What is our understanding of a program theory? And how different is program theory from program logic? Program theory explains how and why a program is expected to work. This therefore means that a clear program theory makes it much easier to choose the most appropriate outcomes to measure in an intervention. This becomes the premise in which program theory needs to lay out the evidence to show why we believe one thing will lead to the next. So the theory, in essence, spells us the sequence of how things will occur. And a good program theory reflects the fact that change happens in stages. These stages can either mirror the cumulative occurrence of the change or the incremental nature of the change that happens. And program theories often are captured in a series of if-then statements. That is, it connotes that if something is done with and for the program participants, then something should change among the participants. An effect must occur among the participants of the intervention as a result of something that has been done. We see that program theory spells out why you expect the changes to happen. And this is located between the if and the then. Which calls for establishing solid evidence in the intermediary between the if and then. Well-established connection is very instrumental to quantify this evidence that is being generated. The program theory also ensures that the idea that the service package that brings about the change accomplishes a goal. Let us look at program logic. Program logic model, on the other hand, is a picture that illustrates the program theory. It's a drawing that shows or illustrates how one thing leads to the next, as in a flow chart. And it illustrates and sets out how resources and activities are aligned that comprise the program and the expected changes that comes from the implementation of that program. It's a common feature that logic model uses short phrases to represent things that are explained in more detail in the program theory. and illustrates linkages between program components and outcomes. So we see the common phenomena of a logic model just being able to use an arrow to show that one thing that leads to the next. So in essence, we see that the logic model constitutes a visual representation of relationships between program inputs, goals, and activities, relationships between operational and organizational resources, relationships between techniques and practices, relationships between expected outputs and effects. What are the common terms in program theory? Let us look at some common terms in program theory, which will be instrumental as we flow among the modules that we have. Articulated program theory. This one explicitly stated version of program theory that is spelled out in some detail as part of a program's documentation and identity, or as a result of evaluators' efforts to formulate a theory. There's a black box evaluation theory. This is an evaluation of program outcomes without the benefit of an articulated program theory to provide insight into what is presumed to be causing those outcomes and why. So the black box evaluation is the direct opposite of the articulated evaluation theory. Evaluability assessment. This one entails negotiation and investigation to determine whether a program meets the preconditions for evaluation. You recall, in module 1, I did share the fact that there's need to assess whether there's need for undertaking an evaluation or not. So for us to arrive at the decision that the need for undertaking an impact evaluation is there, we have in the first place to undertake an evaluability assessment. Impact theory. This is a causal theory describing the cause and effect sequences in which certain program activities are the instigating causes and certain benefits are the effects that they are eventually produced. Implicit program theory. This embodies assumptions and expectations that are inherent in a program's services and practices that have not been fully articulated and recorded. So it's operating on some assumptions and inbuilt expectations. Organizational plan. This constitutes assumptions and expectations about what the program must do to bring about the transactions between the target population and the program that will produce the intended changes. Process theory. This is a combination of programs organizational plan and its service utilization plan into an overall description of assumptions and expectations about how the program is supposed to operate. Service utilization plan. This is about the assumptions and expectations about how target population will make initial contact with program and be engaged with it through completion of intended services. And therefore, it shows the sequence of events through which clients interact with the services that are laid or planned within a program delivery. What is the role of program theory in impact evaluation? As we have rightly described the fact that program theory underpins an analysis of how and why the program intervention will work or be effective. Different types of diagrams are used to represent a program theory, as we already alluded to in the logic models, which show the overall logic of how the intervention is understood to work. The different layouts that are mirrored in the logic models about the program theory are already building and manifesting relationships that will help us understand how the intervention is envisaged to work. As already noted, that impact evaluation is concerned both in demonstrating and measuring effects, as well as to explain and to answer how and why questions. This, therefore, raises the important distinction in evaluation and in impact evaluation in particular, which is that distinction between causality and explanation. The causal links to the effects that occur among the target population and explanation that characterize the effects that are manifested in the targeted population. In impact evaluation, just as it is in scientific research, any explanation that we can make must ultimately rely on good theories. Therefore, opening up the black box that connects the causes and effects in an intervention continuum requires different kinds of analysis. And this analysis is what theories of change and the program theory are intended to support. Any comments on program theory and program logic models, as well as the role of program theory in impact evaluation? Let us briefly look at the theory of change. Again, we are informed and have established that the results-based management training course that we underwent also had theory of change as one of the modules. And so we will not labor to elaborate much on the theory of change, but just tease out a few issues that will be relevant in our discussion as these modules flow. The intent of an impact evaluation is to quantify the causal effects of an intervention for a defined population that is targeted. Results chain is an articulation of theory as to how the intervention is meant to generate the intended effects on the defined population. When those assumptions are articulated more explicitly, they become a theory of change, which essentially describes how causal relationships among activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts are intended to function as the intervention is being rolled out. Explicitly articulating theory will help to identify current situation, the planned or intended situation or the desired state, and what needs to be done to move from one situation to the other. This is what we see when you have a baseline situation. And then departing from the baseline situation, we set ourselves in motion to the desired state. As we said earlier on, this is the then. The if is in between the current situation, and then the then is the one that is the intended situation. So we see that a theory of change is a statement of how the inputs conferred into the intervention, such as the funds, the people, the changes in regulatory or policy environment, eventually lead to the intended outcomes and impacts. So in theory of change, we already project the end point. When we have reached the end, when we have implemented the intervention, this is the status. It identifies the steps in the causal chain with underlying assumptions in sight, which need to hold in order for the theory to operate as expected. You will recall in module 1, where I made reference to the fact that when we have done a program design, we'll be able, through implementation, to single out aspects that work, as well as those which didn't work. And what makes a difference between the two is how the assumptions that were laid at the onset have held in the course of implementation. When the assumptions were held, they became varied, then they enabled the design to work, because that was the premise of planning the intervention. But when for some other reason, the status quo have changed, then the design will no longer perform as expected. And this is key in projecting the theory of change. And then we see the theory of change being instrumental in terms of helping to identify the indicators or variables on which data should be collected. In some cases, it may identify counter theories in which the intervention works in ways other than those which were planned, resulting in unintended outcomes. So when we trace how the unintended outcomes have occurred or have come into being, moving backwards, we should be able to ascertain counter theories to those that were envisaged or devised at the onset of the program. So in all this, what we see is that all theories of change are contingent upon assumptions, and therefore they need to make those assumptions very clear so that the behavioral characteristics that are attached to them, and as well as the necessary conditions at each step, are well articulated without any ambiguity. Any comments on theory of change? Questions? Okay, let's briefly touch on how we can apply theory of change. The analysis of causes and effects that theory of change assists us informs us in the selection of evaluation questions and variables to capture in survey instruments, so that we gather evidence that would speak to the cause and effect, the causal links. Therefore, we see the theory of change's primary role being a heuristic or featuring tool that helps to spur discussion of which outcomes are expected and how they should be captured in the impact evaluation design. As already alluded to, the theory of change illustrates causal relationships that can potentially be investigated. Therefore, it allows those relationships to be compared with available evidence so as to identify hypotheses where new understanding can be generated. When there's already an existing body of evidence, the theory of change will be able to help us identify new areas, hypotheses, where new understanding can be derived. These relationships can also be screened against the funnel of attribution to assess whether sample and effect sizes are likely to be sufficient for analysis at particular points in time. Theory of change is used to establish indicators that reveal how implementation or conditional factors affect outcomes. Any comments and questions on the application of theory of change? It's time now to look at the quiz questions, quiz assignment. Each one of us, let us go through the questions to gauge our grasp of the issues that we have shared under this module. I thank you for your kind attention. Merci beaucoup.